Okay, so kinship and family systems. How does kinship and family systems regulate sexuality? Well, he talks about the taboo on incest, right? Which seems to be a universal law. Certainly, anthropologists such as Levi-Strauss saw the taboo on incest as a universal taboo, one shared by cultures across the globe. But as Weeks points out, the taboo on incest it varies enormously. Like, what counts as incest? Well, in some cultures, marrying your siblings is bad. Many cultures, you shouldn't do it. But you can marry your first cousins. Or you can't marry your siblings or your first cousins, but you can marry your second cousins. You can't have sex with your parents, but you might be able to, or you can't marry your parents either. And you can't, but you might be able to marry another kind of relative, like an aunt or an uncle. So forms of the taboo vary enormously. The Egyptians, of course, siblings did marry, right? Like the Targaryens in Game of Thrones. There was some thought that keeping family lineage pure by sibling marriage would guarantee some sort of royal quality. Of course, what it really does is guarantee that diseases will be passed down, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, so kinship ties and kinship rules are not natural. They're in fact social, right? They're socially decided. The relationships between kinship groups are relationships between groups, right? Often women are exchanged in order to make kinship groups solidify. Kinship groups can encourage or discourage rates of marriage, age of marriage, incidence of reproduction, and social attitudes toward non-procreative sex or non-heterosexual sex, power of men over women, etc., he says. So we have to understand these kinship relationships as really strongly influencing sexual behavior as social groups. He talks about the second, which is economic and social organization. Basically, economics and work conditions shape social lives, and that's true. Women entering the workforce during World War II shaped not only sexual behavior, but shaped the politics to come when the propaganda machines of society and the government had to operate to get women to go back to the home, right, after they had been in the public sphere after World War II. Married women entered the workforce in the 50s and 60s, and that had an impact on things like the number of children people had, patterns of domestic life, having more earners in the family also created the ability of people to buy more things. So there was an economic incentive and an economic boom, and the economy changed, and so on. So, and you know, when there have been times of economic insecurity, there's a lower birth rate. For example, people are talking about how the crash of 2008 led to a much lower birth rate because people put off having children because they couldn't afford them or were worried about being able to afford them. This was also true in the Depression. So economics does shape sexuality and social behaviors around sexuality. Social regulation, which is the third thing he talks about. He talks about the significance of religion, the changing role of the state, and kind of a social moral consensus, which is to say that the church gives way at some point to a more secular kind of regulatory mechanisms such as medicine, right? The law, education, psychology, social work, welfare practices. But the cultural languages still work to keep the rules in place. Slut shaming keeps girls in line and limits what can and cannot be done. So the fourth thing he talks about are political interventions, which again are formal and informal means of control. We might talk about pundits, right? People who call up certain rules, moral rules, and try to enforce them by broadcasting the necessity of them. We might think about that as political interventions. Elected officials, talking about sexual behavior or running their campaigns on ideas that they think people will respond to about regulating sexual behavior. And finally, 5, cultures of resistance, which shape sexuality by resisting the rules, right? Subcultures of male homosexuality, female networks of knowledge about birth control and abortion. In the 60s, before abortion was legal, there were networks of women helping women who needed access to abortion get those, and sometimes performing them themselves. Famously, Jane in Chicago, an organization called Jane, helped women have access to abortion in the era when it was illegal. Subcultures of male homosexuality, free love movements, which we'll talk about, in the 19th century, which resisted marriage norms. New kinds of societies, utopian societies with group marriage, or sort of homosocial, homoerotic societies of, say, single-sex, temporary cultures like those in the gold rush. All of those are operating to shape and resist sexual norms. And so those 5 methods of social regulation, the broad areas that he talks about: kinship and family systems, economic and social organizations, social regulation, political interventions, and the development of cultures of resistance. You might think about these as you're trying to write about the Puritan laws and the sodomy statutes that are on the books today. So this is just a short 2-part introduction for you to get you feeling comfortable with that article. Okay, thanks.